Larry, my dear friend, welcome back. Welcome back to the show. A lot of people in Milan asked me questions about you and Ray. Very, very happy, flattering questions, and I thought I'd pass that on
Much
to you.
appreciated.
Of course. How bad off is Ukraine today, as we speak, mid-May 2024?
Coming apart at the seams. It is, there's a famous movie called Downfall, which is about Hitler's last month in the bunker and just how detached from reality he was. And as Berlin was collapsing in on itself as the Soviets advanced. That's sort of what we're starting to see now. There's great upheaval within the military leadership. The real thing that started to grate on people is that here Zelensky and the Ukrainians have received billions of dollars, literal actual billions of dollars in cash that were to be used to build fortifications put in minefields up there around Kharkiv on the border with Russia. Wasn't built, aren't there. The Russians are literally walking in certain places. And there's a lot of just real anger among some sectors in Ukraine about what happened to this money. Well, I mean, what do you think happened? Some of the Ukrainian elite went off on an international shopping spree. So there's still, Western observers are trying to figure out, is this the big Russian push? Is this a feint? What it is doing, regardless of how big the Russian effort is, it's forcing Ukraine to shift forces from the south, from the Donetsk region and the whole Donbass and Russia northwards to try to staunch the Russian incursion. But I think this is just part of Russia pressing, increasing pressure all along the front, and it's going to force a break. Ukraine will collapse. I think that's becoming more certain with each passing day, and the collapse will come sooner rather than later.
And how does NATO cope with this collapse? What does NATO do next?
They're going to need some big boxes of Kleenex. There are going to be lots of weeping and wailing. They can't do anything. I mean, they can in theory say, "Oh yeah, we're going to mobilize our troops and send them." Oh, good luck with that, because one, how are you going to sustain them in the field if you can even get them there? And two, the Russians have already put you on notice. If you do that, we're going to kill you. What people don't understand is the enormous advantage Russia has over the West. Right now, Russia produces 3 times the number of artillery rounds. Think about that. Ditto for artillery, actual artillery pieces. And unlike the Ukrainians, the Russians are destroying artillery pieces in the Ukrainian inventory on a daily basis. And then when you factor in, there's a new statistic out. The Russians produce as many tanks in 1 month that the United States and Europe combined produce in a year. Think about that. And yet here's NATO saying, "Oh yeah, boy, we're gonna tell those Russians what to do." No, it's not going to happen. The continued use of Western munitions to kill Russian civilians is firming up the resolve of the Russians to say, "Okay, we're going to put an end to this. This is going to stop." And they recognize the only way to stop it is to demilitarize, destroy the military of Ukraine, and candidly destroy the ability of NATO to continue to operate on its borders.
You and Ray, back when we started discussing this, prevailing on your experience in the intelligence community, explain to us how raw, accurate intel from various surveillance and human intelligence makes its way up the chain and is tampered with, tinkered with, and then spun so that the ultimate recipient of that intel, in this case, the President of the United States, or maybe one of his closest advisors, is being told what the briefer, Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, thinks the president wants to hear. Is that still the case now? Or does Joe Biden, in your view, I'll make it easier for you, does Tony Blinken, in your view, does Jake Sullivan, in your view, know how bad things are for the Ukraine military as we speak?
If they don't, they are deaf, dumb, and blind. Because you don't have to have access to classified information to see what's going on. It's becoming increasingly a theme in the media about the disaster that's unfolding. I know that the Center for Strategic and International Studies just put out an analysis. A year ago, they were dressed up in the cheerleader uniform, saying that Russia was on the brink, that the Ukrainians were winning, that all that nonsense that we were debunking at the time. Now they're out saying just the opposite. Boy, Russia's got a pretty robust defense industry, and we're having trouble keeping up. And Russia's got strong military, and Russia outnumbers the Ukraine. So the information is there. It's just a question of, from a political standpoint in the United States, the calculations they're going to make is, if we abandon Ukraine now, is it going to hurt us in the election? And we're already seeing, hey, they're doing sort of the same thing with Israel. They're now saying, hey, we're not sending any more weapons if you keep this up, if you go into Rafah. Well, Israel has a lot more sway in the United States than the Ukrainians do. So I would think they're looking for an exit strategy now in the West.
Well, what will it take for Ukraine to negotiate with the Russians? Regime change in Ukraine?
Yeah, no, there's no other way. Zelensky's already said he will not talk to the Russians. Okay. The Russians don't want to talk to him. And in a week or so, that whole issue is going to be moved. And in fact, a week from tomorrow, on Tuesday, Zelensky's term is up. Just because he didn't hold an election doesn't mean that he therefore gets to stay on in power and be considered legitimate. At that point, the Russians will consider him illegitimate, and he will then become a legitimate target of war as far as Russia is concerned. Up to this point, Russia has not. It has sort of abided by the concept, we don't think one state should be out murdering, killing, assassinating the leaders of other states. They've held to that. Next Tuesday, that goes away as far as for Zelensky, and his days are numbered now.
How dumb not to have had elections. How dumb to expose himself to that. I mean, what has he become? Just some sort of a rump holdover dictator who's only there for as long as the security forces will allow him to stay there?
Yeah, well, hey, being in charge had all of its perks and benefits. Some of those billions of dollars that were supposed to be invested in building defenses up around Kharkiv have gone into his pockets. And, he's got to be the man. He's been completely enabled. A lot of this is, I think a lot of it goes back to his previous history as a, quote, comedian and actor. You get to a place where you love the adulation of the crowd. You play to the crowd. And man, when he was the Churchill of the 21st century, remember when they were calling him that?
Right.
The accolades that were flowing his way, you get that kind of praise, it's pretty heady. And he became enamored of it. And then at the same time, he began moving against all political opponents, killing some of them, having some of them killed, and shutting down opposition press and media, and going after the Russian Orthodox Church, which the very beginning of orthodoxy, of the Orthodox Christian movement, began in Kiev in like 989. We're talking more than 1,000 years ago. And he's trying to erase that history. So he's going to wind up in history books as a stain on Ukraine.
And who comes in? General Zaluzhny waiting in the wings?
That's where the battle's going to be. The problem with Zelensky is, as I pointed out before, he's closely aligned with the neo-Nazis. Russians aren't going to deal with neo-Nazis. They're going to destroy the neo-Nazis. They did it once, they'll do it again. They did it in 1945. And in fact, with their Remembrance Day last Thursday, May 9th, where, the almost the entire population of Russia is mobilized to remember their dead and their losses. I was being interviewed by a reporter from Izvestia, a young lady in her mid-20s, and this topic came up, and I said, did anyone in your family die? And so she began talking about her grandfather who died in a tank battle, and her great-grandfather and her great-grandmother, who was a physician in Leningrad at the time. Both of them died. And as she's talking about this, she's tearing up and becoming very emotional. And then it talked about that her grandfather was, as a young boy, survived without his parents, but grew up, became a lawyer, became successful, and created a family. These people remember because they've spent blood in this. We in the United States haven't shed a damn drop of blood. We like to think we have, but it doesn't even begin to compare to what the Russians have experienced. And so that's why we're so easily willing to support going to war in Iraq, going to war in Afghanistan, going to war in Somalia, going to war in Libya. By God, we'll send our boys anywhere, because the politicians making these decisions, they don't have to send their children, or they don't have to send themselves. And I guarantee you, if we instituted a system that any politician who votes to send Americans to war or to support wars overseas either has to go themselves or they have to send their oldest child. And because I tell you what, you put that system in place, this crap will stop immediately.
Now, you're going to love some clips we'll show in a few minutes of Lindsey Graham saying that just as Harry Truman dropped 2 atomic bombs to end the war in Japan, which we all know was unnecessary and was done to terrify the Russians, Bibi Netanyahu can drop whatever bombs he wants and use whatever equipment he needs to defeat the Palestinians. But before we get there, does Russia fully control the east, the parts of the country that it has, from which it has chased the Ukraine military, or are there still pockets of areas there that they don't control?
No, the areas that are behind their front lines are under their control. There's not a problem there. The only thing that still persists is Ukrainian artillery, or actually it's not so much artillery, it's a U.S. supplied attack missiles, British supplied Storm Shadows, and HIMARS. Those systems are being used to launch attacks on civilian areas. And I want to emphasize the difference between throwing a rocket into a city where you don't have an established Russian military presence. In other words, they're not occupying a variety of buildings and hotels with their presence because they're outside the city. They don't have to do that. It is a civilian area. Just yesterday, they hit an apartment building. Killed the Ukrainians did, killing at least 15 people. Whereas when Russia's attacking into these cities, as they did with Avdiivka and Bakhmut, those cities are under the military control, and the Ukrainians are embedded. The Ukrainian military are embedded in different buildings. So it's not the same thing, and so this is continuing to, I guess, drive the Russian offensive, because they're going to continue to push farther and farther to the west so that they can shut down any ability of these people to strike inside what was Russia proper prior to February 2022.
What will become of the parts of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River once the west of the river, the western part, where Kyiv is, once the eastern part is under Russian control and the Russians don't see the need to fight anymore?
The Russians will be in a strong position from a negotiating standpoint to have a say in the kind of government that will then be established over there, because Russia's going to cut them off from the Black Sea. And without that, this country is just literally isolated. It's going to be, it's like depriving someone of oxygen. So, but I do not anticipate that the Russians are going to cross the Dnieper in mass and try to occupy most of Western Ukraine. And let's recall that a lot of the territory in Western Ukraine, Lvov, for example, that used to be Polish territory. There's also other territory that the Romanians and Hungarians saw as their own, and they've still got ethnic Romanians, ethnic Hungarians in those parts of Western Ukraine that feel a more natural affinity with Hungary and Romania as opposed to Ukraine.